Welcome to the Global Missions Podcast, a show for Christ followers who want to participate more effectively in God's work both at home and to the ends of the earth. Visit us at globalmissionspodcast.com to find show notes, resources, and previous episodes. You can also engage with us through Twitter and Facebook. We would love to hear from you. And now, here's your host, Rob Magwood, better known to many friends as Mags.
Hi, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Global Missions Podcast. I am really looking forward to this episode. It is absolutely packed with ideas and illustrations about how to access some of the untapped potential in our churches for global missions. Ellen is highly creative, so buckle up and prepare to be encouraged and challenged by this conversation. Our guest today is Ellen Livingood, who is the founder and director of Catalyst Services, and she is no stranger to the Global Missions Podcast. Welcome back, Ellen.
Thanks. It's great to be back with you.
Catalyst Services is an organization that provides resources and consulting and training to local churches and mission agencies. Ellen has a broad background in communications, administration, partnership development. She served as the director of global outreach at a local church, and her passion is to strategically engage the church's untapped potential for today's amazing global opportunities. We're really glad to have Ellen back again. Ellen, would you just review for us a little about your experience and your heart for helping churches participate in global missions?
Thanks, Megs. I'd love to, and I'm glad for what the podcasts are doing and how they are helping churches and missions. You know, the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over and hoping for a different result. And I think church missions leaders come asking me for help, and many times they're kind of thinking we just want to stay and kind of doing what we're doing, and if we can just do it a little better, maybe we'll get a different result. And reality in our fast-changing world today really dictates that we have to think in new ways, not just tweak the old ones. So what I enjoy doing is helping churches think outside that box and beginning to realize that and welcome the opportunity to change. One of my favorite concepts is try piloting something new. We're in an age where there's just opportunities to say, how can we do things in a fresh new way and see what God wants to do with them. And so helping churches think about finding the space and the resources to think and do missions in fresh ways is just really a fun part of my job.
Mm-hmm. Well, there are those of us out here who really appreciate that too. Ellen is one of the people in the missions world who presses me to think creatively and to think about new possibilities. Tell us just a bit about Catalyst Services and what kind of resources your organization offers to churches.
Well, we offer help to churches in three primary areas. We publish a lot of online articles and practical tools that you can find on our catalystservices.org website. We have about 150 issues of our monthly postings there that you can search online, and you can sign up for free future issues there as well. We provide individual consulting for churches and agencies and increasingly networks as well. Thanks to the internet, this can be online or in person. And then we hold training and conferences. Next month, we're going to be running one that trains coaches to help their churches think about a strategic focus, for instance. And all that kind of information is also on our site.
Mm-hmm. Very good. We will include the Catalyst Services website. Mention it just quickly now, Ellen.
catalystservices.org.
There it is. It will be in the show notes as well. And I would encourage your consideration of that website. Lots of great material there. Today, we're going to discuss about how churches can engage some of their untapped potential, of course, as it relates to global missions. Ellen, in your experience, what does this untapped potential look like?
I always like to tell the story about how God started me on this recognition of a whole new opportunity out there. It was many years ago. I had become the director of missions at my own church, and shortly thereafter, we sent 3 guys down to the Baja area of Mexico to build church benches. One of those guys was an attorney. One was an executive who ran the large hospital in our area, and the third person was the vice president of a large pharmaceutical company. And I put those 3 guys on an airplane to go down to Mexico to build benches. And I'm thinking two things. One is I have no idea if these guys know how to build benches or if anybody was going to be able to sit in these benches. And secondly, and more important, wasn't I wasting talent? Was this really the best use of these people? And so it wasn't long after that I received a call from a missionary working in Poland. And she asked if we could do a week of workshops on how people could start their own businesses. This was only a few years after the wall had come down, and all kinds of people in this little church had grand ideas about starting their own business and being an entrepreneur, and they had no idea how to do it. And so she said, could you send a team? And I had no idea, because we'd never done anything like this before. But quickly I identified 5 guys in our church, and happened to be all guys, who were all had some aspect of business experience. But none of them that I knew of had missions experience or any interest in missions even. And I thought, I don't know if they'll, I don't even know if they'll go. And so I asked the 5, and what do you think the response was?
Well, a few of them, maybe.
Well, we had 5 out of 5,
5 out of 5.
immediately
Wow.
said to me, I would love to go. And so we sent those guys off, and it was not only a blessing to the people in that church, but they also opened it up to outsiders, and so they used it as a means of evangelism. And afterwards, one of the guys on that team said to me, this is the first time I ever saw a way to use for God what I had been doing 10 hours a day for 3 decades of my life. And that was such an aha moment for me. And that was over 20 years ago, but it began a major transformation in my thinking about how we were looking at missions. So you ask about, the kinds of untapped potential that we're looking at. And there's just a lot, and we'll talk about some other illustrations as we go along. But let me just mention a couple things. The first one that I think is just a huge opportunity is in the area of communication skills. I just find so many missionaries struggle with this area for lots of reasons. Maybe they don't have skills in it. Maybe they're just too busy. Sometimes they just struggle to know what the people back home don't know or don't remember. They struggle with messaging for younger generations. And yet, sitting in our churches here are people whose jobs involve those skills every single day. We've got digital media specialists, photographers, and writers, and editors, and social media managers. And many of these people are targeting younger generations. They know what people in the pews don't know. And yet, so often, we just don't engage them in missions. So it's a great opportunity to think about, how can we have a win-win situation on both ends? We've got people with computer skills. I often hear missionaries saying, I don't know can't get my computer running right, or, I know I need to use new programs. We've got people sitting in our churches with those kinds of skills. Another really fun story I'll tell quickly is just, we often ask, what's your skill, and kind of brainstorming ways with people, and just having fun with seeing whether they can stump us on things. And one person told me that, their skill was taxidermy. It's like, okay, taxidermy. Let me think. Taxidermy. That's a challenge. But so anyhow, afterwards, I sometimes use that as an illustration of, okay, you don't always know. And I happened to be sharing it with, and I had never even thought about this, but I was sharing it with some missionaries who were working with First Nations people in Canada. And all of a sudden, in the middle of my using that illustration, somebody popped up and said, we can use them. We need that kind of person. So it was just really funny, because obviously there's a lot of hunting in that part of the world, and to have a skill of taxidermy fit for them. So it was just kind of another illustration of, there are so many ways that we can use people if we think creatively.
Mm-hmm. If we can figure out taxidermy and folding it into global missions, then there's hope for many of us. Let's begin to unpack this then. How do we begin to unleash this potential and see people using their gifts and expertise?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I really love that question, because we need to begin to say, how do we unpack these things? And the first thing I think is for every church to realize that they're sitting on a gold mine. We need to see people in our churches as each having a valuable investment that God has made in their life. And as Paul tells us, leaders in the church are instructed to equip the saints for ministry. And some of that's inside the church, some of it's local or regional. But certainly there's a significant portion of it that God has invested in them to reach the nations. There's amazing talent sitting, I think, in every church that will never be used unless and until they're engaged somehow in global outreach, because there's just opportunities in global outreach that we just don't find anywhere else. So it's just really exciting to begin seeing every congregation in that kind of a light. And then one of the things I challenge churches about regularly is to change our paradigm in terms of how we think about sending adults in particular. We always think of sending teams, and teams are not necessarily the best way. In fact, I think they're seldom the best way to send adults. Teams mean there's a lot of logistics for the people on the ground in high security areas. They've got way too high a profile. You got to figure out something for groups to do, and that's not necessarily the most helpful thing. So instead of that, I challenge churches to think about the opportunities that they have. What are the need that is there, whether it's their missionary or a national partner? What specifically do they need done? And then how many people do you need to do it? Often it's only one or two specialists. And then when is the best time for them to come and do that? And if we kind of change and think in a new way, there's all kinds of interesting opportunities. Let me give you another one that I think is just a really fun one that tends to blow people's minds. Blew mine when I first heard about it. There's untapped potential in tourists. Think, wow, okay. So one church, one missionary team that was serving in China began to recruit believers from their churches back in North America to come and be tourists in their town. Now, there's lots of people who love to be tourists, so this is a gift that's not hard to tap into. But what they did was they matched people when they came with students that, particularly higher level students that were in their ESL programs. And basically they said, you have got 2 or 3 days nonstop with these young adults. Use whatever opportunities you have to share the gospel. And it was stuff they couldn't necessarily do because they were living there. But these tourists, were going to be gone before the government would discover what had happened. And so they had a whole ministry of saying, you've got 2 or 3 days opportunities to share your life and share your love for the Lord and just interact with our young adults in that way. What an interesting, creative way of engaging people in a way that was really useful on the field.
Well, some super ideas here. And Ellen, I love your enthusiasm and energy for this stuff. As we look forward, what are some of the hurdles or barriers that you have seen that prevent churches from accessing this untapped potential?
Well, the first, and I guess it's the flip side of what I just said, is the fact that we don't recognize the potential that's sitting there. And we can talk some more about that. But also, I think that an important piece of this is that field workers, whether it's missionaries or whether it is national leaders or partners that we're working with, need to catch a vision of how many opportunities there are and ways that they could engage people. So this needs to be a conversation that begins and goes on about what is it that you could offload to someone else? What is it that we could send someone to do that would really be useful? I had one church that described it this way. They said, we had some workers on a team of 13 people in their country. And we said to our workers, now you need to remember, you do not have 13 people on your team. You have 3,013. It happened to be a large church. They said, we want you to think of every person in our church as a member of your team. So if you're sitting in a circle talking about something that you believe God wants you to do and you don't have the resources, or you don't have the expertise, or you need help with this in some way, we want you to know that you can reach back and ask us for anything. And that was pretty bold. They said, we didn't know, and we certainly couldn't guarantee that we could meet their need. But they said, it really transformed how we looked at that ministry and how they looked at it. So they kind of tested us. And the first thing they said, well, we've got some issues with marriages. And could you send someone who could, run a marriage seminar? And they said, oh, that was a good one. That one was one we could respond to very easily. And so they began to build this kind of a mentality on both sides that we're a part of you. And if we are partners, then it means that God's invested things in us to help meet whatever the need is on your end. So the vision from both sides. And then one of the other harder aspects, perhaps, is thinking about how do we help field workers to have the capacity to facilitate the kinds of things that we can come and do. And that's different at different places, but we need to be asking those kinds of questions. And I think there is things that we can do in that direction.
Do you mean, in that case, Ellen, do you mean like working with your on-field workers to help them get ready to access these?
Yes.
This potential? Okay.
Yes, because sometimes, particularly if you're sending a flow of people, even as individuals or, 2 or 3 at a time, there's still logistics to that. And how do we help with that? Are some of the things that we are doing potential for expanding their time? For instance, one example, and this is actually both a untapped potential as well as a capacity builder, is that there's a ministry I know that engages untapped potential by matching mostly either young adults or retirees to missionary families on the field where they need a nanny. And oftentimes it's new missionaries who are still learning language, and therefore, for the mom, particularly to be able to really invest time in studying the language, they need somebody to watch the kids. Or maybe, it's a mature couple on the field, and again, it just takes a lot of time to run a household and take care of kids, and having somebody there who's able to help, whether it's for a month or 3 months or 6 months, whatever works there, frees up most often the mom, but maybe both parents. It builds their capacity because of having that opportunity. Sometimes that person also has done some tutoring of kids and who are doing homeschooling or something like that. So again, that's a capacity building, but also a way that untapped potential can be used.
Oh, very good. Well, in a moment, we're going to ask Ellen to expand on these ideas. And already so many ideas flowing here. She will suggest some practical ways for churches to get started in utilizing the gifts of a broader spectrum of the congregation. Just before we get to that, we'd like to share with you this missions resource that we hope will be helpful to you and your church.
Are you looking to expand and improve your church's mission efforts? Catalyst Services is ready to help you out with great resources and excellent training opportunities. Visit catalystservices.org to learn more and sign up for Postings, a monthly e-newsletter with practical advice and tools for churches. And now, back to today's conversation.
Okay, we're back with Ellen Livingood, who is challenging us to unleash the untapped missions potential in our churches. Ellen, as you seek to, encourage churches to utilize these gifts, how do you suggest they measure success? How do they know if they're doing a good job of it or not?
One of the questions that I suggest that churches ask is, do our people recognize their potential? Before you can engage it, you have to recognize it, they have to recognize it. And part of this is by telling stories about your people who are doing some of this. And many times churches, there's already people in your churches who may be doing things, whether it's locally or globally, that are using some pretty amazing gifting that's an unusual thing or maybe a usual thing used in an unusual place or something. So telling those kinds of stories help people recognize it. So that first question is, do people recognize that they are personally gifted by God and that has something to do with the nations? And then does everybody in our church know one additional way they could engage their personal resources? And if they don't, do they know that you as a missions team want to help them to identify that? I think that missions leadership is usually seen as a group of people who coordinate a program, but I don't think very often our leadership teams are seen as a resource of people who will help me find my place, particularly if I'm not seeing myself as a long-term missionary. And so I think we need to build an understanding in our congregation. Do they see our missions team that way? And are we ready to come alongside of people in that way? And then one other thing I think that's a real success measure is, are we helping people to move into a level of what sometimes is called influencers? And that's people who do this kind of a thing on a repeated basis. They are people who have a particular gift and they go back and use it multiple times in the same place. And that really multiplies their blessing in that location. For instance, I know a guy who's a businessman in his late 50s, probably, who began to connect with a missionary team in Indonesia and got to know them, visited a couple times, and they recognized that he had business expertise that they needed, and they needed platforms in order to be able to stay there. And so he began to be a consultant and advisor with them. He did it when he went a couple times a year, but he also worked with them, long distance in the internet. And then he also began to be part of their regular team meetings. And they said it was amazing. He was on the other side of the world, but it was so often this guy who in the middle of the meeting would say, "Now, wait a minute, we haven't heard from so-and-so. I think, or so-and-so just made a point a little while ago. Let's come back and rethink that." He just had this ability to pull things together in a way. And he also began to have a real ministry to the team members individually. He cared about them. He knew them well. He knew the kinds of things they were struggling with. And this team leader said to me, we value him. I would say his value is at least equal to half a long-term missionary. Now, this was a guy who only went 2 or 3 times a year for a week, but because he repeated, because he had involvement in between, because he really got in depth in terms of relationships, he had tremendous value. And those kinds of people and relationships have a lot of value. That's when we can really measure success.
Wow. In this case, you would really consider that gentleman as a member of the team.
They did. They do. Yeah.
From the home context, but participating so deliberately, so intentionally. And of course, that could be over a range of, number of hours. In this case, he invested quite a bit. Others could participate regularly. What I really appreciated in this story that you just shared, Ellen, is the integration of long-term and short-term together. And it's not one or the other, but they complement each other in such rich ways. That was evident in this particular illustration again, how the long-term worker on the field benefits greatly from effective short-term work.
Well said. I'll recruit you to my team there, Max.
Sure. Okay. Yeah, let's go. Well, let's say that this conversation has convinced someone who's listening, someone serving in a church, and they say, we really ought to step toward this. This is a good idea. What do you recommend a church does as a first step toward unlocking this potential?
There's 2 things, and we have a couple of resources that relate to these that we would like to share. The first is building a list of some of the gifts and passions and expertise in your church. And we have a simple survey form that you can use online or on paper or however you would like to do it, and to just begin to ask some of these questions. Now, many churches do surveys, but those surveys seldom ask enough of questions that relate to a global opportunity. For instance, they don't often ask, what languages do you speak? And many churches have people who have maybe grown up in a bilingual home and you had no idea that they spoke this or that language. And, do you travel regularly for business to a certain place? Those kinds of questions don't come up in those usual surveys and can be very useful in this. So we do have a sample for that. You can amend it any way you want, but we have something we'd be happy to share with you on that one. And then another thing is begin to talk to your missionaries. And you may have just 1 or 2 as you look at your list of those you support and say, I think these missionaries would be really open to this. They have a context in which I just have a feeling. And so open a conversation about that. Another resource that we have is just a long list of potential ways. Kind of begin brainstorming with your workers about here are some things that might be possibilities that churches have used, various ways of connecting and of using those resources. So that's something else that we've put together and you can use as a beginning point for those kinds of conversations.
Wow, two very helpful resources there. And let me just affirm to our audience that this is typical of Ellen, being generous with things that she's thought of, developed, and sharing, and then inviting you to modify it so that it works well in your context. That's what Catalyst Services is like. We will include all of these resources in the show notes, links to those resources as well. Maybe I'll ask you just at this point, Ellen, if any of our listeners would like to follow up with you, what's the best way to reach out to you?
It's great just to start with an email to ellen@catalystservices.org.
Very good. I've got one last question for you. Because we've talked so much about local churches, imagine with me, Ellen, that you have the opportunity to stand in front of a missions committee together with the church pastor, and they would really like to do a good job of this. They really want to do missions well. What would you take the opportunity to say to them? How would you encourage them forward?
I would just challenge them with the concept that as leaders, they have both a privilege and a responsibility to help people know how to engage all that God's invested in them. And I believe that sitting in your church today, whether it's small and maybe it's in terms of dozens or it's larger in terms of hundreds or thousands of people who really desperately long for God to use them in some really significant way, but they don't think they have anything to offer or they have no idea how to engage it. You have an amazing opportunity to open doors for them that are really life transformational. I've heard people come back from one of these kinds of experiences and say, this is what God made me for. How amazing if you as a leader began to create the connections where more people in your congregation had that kind of experience and at the same time have an impact around the world.
Beautiful vision. Ellen, thanks so much again for being with us and sharing with this group of listeners. We appreciate your ministry and warmly recommend it. catalystservices.org for a visit there. Ellen, thanks for being with us today.
Thanks so much for the opportunity. Blessings on what you're doing.
Well, that's it for today. A great conversation again with Ellen. Remember that you can find show notes at globalmissionspodcast.com, which includes the reference links to everything she mentioned today, including the previous episode where she talked about how to establish a strategy, a global mission strategy for your church. If you enjoyed this episode, we would sure appreciate a review in iTunes or your favorite podcast app, and we invite you to subscribe so you don't miss any upcoming episodes. If you have a suggested topic or interview you would like us to consider, we would be glad to hear from you. This episode is brought to you by the Global Missions Toolbox and produced by Send International and the Jaffrey Center for Global Initiatives in collaboration with other like-minded agencies. On behalf of the team, thank you for listening today. We invite you to join us again in 2 weeks when we'll continue to explore this grand adventure of being Christ's witnesses to the ends of the earth.